ready for a trip back in time. It's 1914. Tensions are running high in Europe. And then, boom, the first shots of World War I ring out. But get this, it wasn't in some European city or trench. It was in Togo, Africa.
Wow. I always think of those images of the trenches in Europe.
Right. That's the common picture we have of World War I. But the reality is this conflict went global, and it left a huge mark on the African continent, a story that often gets overlooked.
Yeah, definitely not something you hear a lot about.
So today, we're using this article, 6 Key World War I Battles Fought in Africa, to really dig into what happened there and the impact of this conflict.
Okay.
One of the first things that jumps out when you look into this is, well, the sheer number of Africans pulled into this war, over 2 million.
2 million, wow.
Yeah, just let that sink in for a second.
Yeah.
2 million lives directly affected, and tragically, over 150,000 soldiers lost their lives. And that's not even counting the countless civilian casualties.
I can imagine war and famine, they go hand in hand.
Exactly. This wasn't some far-off conflict for the people of Africa.
Right.
It was happening in their home.
Right. And you have to think, these weren't exactly volunteer armies, right?
You're hitting on a crucial point. These were largely conscripted armies, meaning many Africans were forced into service by the very same European powers that were, well, ruling over them.
Oh, wow. So they're being forced to fight and possibly die for the very colonizers who took their land?
Exactly. Imagine that, the weight of that situation. It's pretty heavy stuff. And the human cost is really driven home when you hear things like, one historian put it this way, the war touched almost every African group and family.
Wow. It's impossible to even wrap your head around those ripple effects, the loss.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, beyond just the human toll, the African front was very different from the European one, especially when it comes to, like, the style of warfare.
In what way?
Well, we tend to think of trenches, tanks, poison gas, all those technological advancements. Those were hallmarks of the European front.
Right.
But in Africa, it was a whole different story.
Okay. So less mechanized, more.
Well, the article actually goes into the reasons behind this. A lot of it had to do with geography dictating everything. Vast distances, rough terrain, and very limited infrastructure. Trying to move tanks or heavy artillery in those environments, it was a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, I can see that.
So battles often became these very brutal clashes of infantry, relying more on, older weaponry and strategies.
So almost like stepping back in time, militarily speaking, in a way.
Yeah, you could say that.
Interesting. And what about artillery? Was that a factor at all?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. Artillery was used less frequently in Africa, but when it was used, it was often deployed more for its psychological impact than for actual strategic bombardment. Just imagine, you're on this vast savanna and you hear the booming of these cannons echoing across the land.
Oh, yeah. I can only imagine the effect that would have, instilling fear in both soldiers and civilians.
Right. A powerful tool, even if used sparingly. So we've talked about some of the overarching differences, but the article also highlights 6 specific key battles. I'm curious, are there any big themes that tie them together, would you say?
There are definitely some common threads, yeah. And they tell us a lot about the dynamic of the conflict. What really stands out to me is this constant disconnect between what the European powers thought would happen and then what actually happened on the ground. They, well, to put it bluntly, they frequently underestimated the capabilities and the pure resilience of the African soldiers.
Leading to some surprising outcomes, I'd imagine. Surprising outcomes is an understatement from what I've read. So let's dive into that first battle the article highlights, the Battle of Garua in 1914.
Yeah, Garua. That's a prime example of the Europeans completely misjudging their opponents. See, the German-trained African troops, they were known as Askari, and these guys, they put up such a fight, such fierce resistance, that they actually took back a fort from the Allies. Yeah, it was a huge blow to the Allies early on. Really forced them to rethink their entire approach.
It really makes you question this whole idea of, it being a one-sided conflict. You know what I mean? We were talking earlier about underestimating the African soldiers.
Yeah.
What were these Askari like? I mean, as soldiers, what set them apart?
Oh, they were very well trained, very disciplined. Often they even outperformed the expectations of their European counterparts.
Really?
Oh, yeah. The Germans, they really invested in training these guys. They knew the kind of advantage they would have, especially in that terrain.
Right, makes sense.
But, their motivations for fighting were complex, too.
How so?
Well, some of them, they fought for the promise of pay or, a better social standing. Others felt a sense of loyalty, to their local chiefs who had decided to side with the Germans. And then you have others who saw it as a way to fight back against being displaced from their land by these colonial powers.
Wow. Talk about a tangled web of, well, allegiances, ambitions, everything. Adds a whole other layer of complexity to things. Okay, so that's Galway. The Allied landing at Douala in 1914. This one takes it to the coast, right?
Yeah.
What made that one so important?
Douala, it really highlights the significance of logistics in this whole thing, and more specifically, the importance of controlling those ports.
Right, those coastal access points.
Well,
makes sense.
Whoever controlled the ports, well, they controlled the supplies, the reinforcements, everything. It really dictated the entire flow of the war.
Logistical puzzles, but like on a massive scale.
Exactly.
Makes you appreciate the kind of strategic thinking that went into each of these campaigns. Okay, on to the next one. The Battle of Tonga. This is where we finally meet that German commander, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. He was known for, well, to put it mildly, his unconventional tactics.
Lettow-Vorbeck, yeah, he was a fascinating guy. He understood that those traditional European tactics, they weren't going to cut it in East Africa. So he embraced this whole guerrilla warfare approach.
Interesting. So how did that play out in an actual battle?
Well, at Tonga, he completely outmaneuvered a much larger British force. It was a humiliating defeat for the British. He used everything, things like fake troop movements. He would strategically place mirrors to confuse the British, disrupt their communications.
The article even mentioned something about a swarm of bees getting involved.
Yeah, it sounds crazy, but it just goes to show how unpredictable things were.
I bet. Can't imagine that was in the battle plans. Okay, moving on to the Battle of Gurin in 1915. What was the significance of this one?
Well, Gurin shows the Germans trying to kind of flip the script, seize the initiative. Their big goal was to push into Nigeria, British territory. Hope was to disrupt their operations, maybe even force them to divert resources from other fronts.
Ambitious. Did it work?
It was a gamble that didn't really pay off for Lettow-Vorbeck. The British, they held their ground. So a bold move, but not exactly a victory.
Right. Okay, so this next one, the Battle of the Rufiji Delta. This one shifts our focus. We're talking naval warfare now.
Yeah, this one's all about the German cruiser Königsberg. It had been causing major problems for the Allies, harassing shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean.
A thorn in their side.
Big time. The Allies knew they had to take it out. But the Königsberg, it was elusive. It used its speed, took advantage of just how vast the ocean was, and it managed to evade capture for a long time.
So how'd they find it?
It eventually holed up in the Rufiji Delta. It's this network of shallow channels, mangrove swamps, all right off the coast of German East Africa.
Sounds like the perfect hiding spot.
It was a smart move. The Germans knew those big Allied ships, they couldn't navigate those shallow waters, so it became this intense game of cat and mouse. The Allies had to rely on smaller boats, and they even started using planes for reconnaissance.
Planes in World War I.
Yeah, aviation was still pretty new, but it was already changing how wars were fought. The Allies were just beginning to understand how valuable air reconnaissance could be, especially for spotting enemy positions, directing artillery fire.
It's amazing to think how technology was changing the game, even in these really remote parts of the war. So what happened with the Königsberg? Did they ever get it?
They did. Despite the Königsberg's hiding spot, the Allies eventually managed to sink it. But Lettow-Vorbeck, always resourceful, he salvaged some of the ship's guns and used them for his land defenses.
Wow. This guy was always a step ahead. So that takes us to the final battle in the article, the Battle of Namakura. This one takes place in 1918, right? The war's almost over at this point.
Yeah. And Namakura, even this late in the war, it really showcases Lettow-Vorbeck's resilience, his ability to adapt and, well, frankly, get a little creative with his tactics.
How so?
Well, he managed to get his hands on a Portuguese map, a captured map.
A map. That doesn't sound like much.
You'd be surprised. A good map in wartime, that's intel. This particular map, it gave Lettow-Vorbeck all this detailed information about the enemy's positions.
Ah, okay. I see where you're going with this.
He used that intel to plan a surprise attack on a Portuguese-British garrison at Namakura. The attack was quick, it was decisive, it resulted in a German victory, and importantly, it provided them with those much-needed supplies, ammunition, all that.
A good reminder that battles aren't always won by just brute force. Sometimes it's about intelligence, strategy, even a little bit of luck. So all these battles, this whole front, it really makes you think about the long-term impact, Yep. The war officially ended in 1918. What did that actually look like in Africa, in those places we've been talking about?
Well, geopolitically speaking, the war completely redrew the map of Africa. The German colonial empire, it was gone. Their former territories were divvied up among those victorious Allied powers.
Talk about a tangible consequence. Just like that, lines on a map change, and the lives of millions are impacted.
Absolutely. But the effects of the war, they went way deeper than just, some lines on a map. Like the article said, it challenged this whole idea of European invincibility. That had a profound impact on African societies. Remember, these weren't just battles happening somewhere else. This was their land.
Right, they saw firsthand what these global powers were capable of, both the good and the bad.
Exactly. They saw the devastation of war up close. And, maybe most important, they saw the courage of their own people, the strategic skill.
So it's like it planted these seeds of doubt, right?
Yeah.
Doubt that maybe those European powers weren't invincible after all.
Exactly. And I think those seeds, they eventually grew into the wave of independence movements that swept across Africa in the decades after the war. It's hard to overstate that impact.
That's a good point. And it wasn't just about like military victories or losses. The war, it disrupted everything.
Yeah.
Traditional ways of life, economies, social structures. It threw those societies into turmoil.
Absolutely. It forced them onto a global stage, whether they were ready or not.
Really makes you think about all those individual stories, the people who lived through this.
It's incredible when you stop and think about it.
How did they rebuild their lives? How did they shape the future of their communities, their nations, in the aftermath of all this?
Questions worth asking. I think it's a good reminder for all of us that history, it's not just dates and battles and treaties. It's about people facing these huge challenges. It's about their resilience.
Absolutely. It's been eye-opening to take a deep dive into this part of World War I, something we don't often hear about. To think battles fought far away from those trenches in Europe, they had such a huge impact on the course of history, not just in Africa, but around the world.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. We have to look beyond just the well-known narratives if we really want to understand the past.
Couldn't agree more. There are always more stories to uncover, more angles to consider. And often, it's these less explored parts of history that hold the most surprising insights. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the past. We hope it's giving you a new perspective on World War I and its lasting legacy in Africa.